Welcome, everybody. We are so glad to have you with us this afternoon. As we move into 5786, a new world is opening up before us. I'm Rabbi Sarah Berman. I'm the Director of Jewish Culture and Programming here at Central Synagogue. I'm alongside Dr. Shira Epstein, the Senior Director for for Adult Engagement. That's our department. I know where I work. And we have with us our special guest this afternoon. Rachel Brandenburg from the Israel Policy Forum has been a very welcome and trusted advisor and teacher to us here at Central Synagogue over the last couple of years as this war has unfolded, and perhaps now as it is reaching a conclusion. Rachel is joining us from Washington, D.C., where she is based, to share with us an update, what is happening, what might happen next, and how we can think about what's going on in Israel and Gaza in a wider historical and geopolitical context. Rachel, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be with the virtual audience here. We are in quite a moment. I found it very poetic that the ceasefire was announced, or there was an announcement that there would be a deal. I think it was right after the first set of Chag of Sukkot, and even more so going into the second set of Chag, 2 years after October 7th happened, that the hostages came home. So it really has been quite a week, quite a moment. I was skeptical, but pleasantly happily proven wrong, what we've seen so far. So I think we're in a hopeful moment, but also a precarious moment. I am very cognizant that, it was wonderful to see the living hostages come home on Monday. Now, arguably equally as difficult, if not more difficult, work is yet to come to figure out what happens next in Gaza. Does phase 2 of the 20-point plan, or phase 2 through 20, depending how you define it? What happens? What do we see? How can Israel begin to heal from this 2-year nightmare? Will the war actually be over? Prime Minister Netanyahu is signaling that maybe not. The IDF chief of staff came out and pretty clearly declared victory and said, we're done. I saw today that they're starting to process and think about issuing commendations from the war, which usually only happens toward the end or after a battle is over. So the awards that people will get for their conduct during a war. So on one hand, politically, we'll see. Militarily, there seem to be signaling that at least the war as we've known it for the past 2 years has come to an end. Now Israel will have to heal. Politically, there are wide open questions of what happens to Prime Minister Netanyahu and his coalition. I think we'll have to see where that goes over the coming months, both what does he want to do and how does he want to maneuver, but also what are his government, what do some of them decide to do? And then in Gaza, I think it's a big open question. President Trump's 20-point plan, I think of as more as principles. It laid out a ton of different steps, each of which are very important to see a sustainable peace and to see Gaza rebuilt, and Israel develop some sort of sustainable security that doesn't involve consistently going back to war with Gaza. But none of the details were worked out. So President Trump declared after his summit in Egypt earlier this week that we are already in phase 2. The negotiations have begun. We're well on our way. And at the moment, he seems committed to making that happen. But the types of negotiations and the types of details that have to be developed to figure out even just a handful of the near-term challenges, I think, are pretty significant. So among those, what happens with Hamas disarmament? We've already seen in the last 24 hours that Prime Minister Netanyahu and to some extent President Trump are starting to talk about, well, if Hamas doesn't disarm, then we're going to disarm them, said President Trump. For Israel, Hamas disarmament or not disarming could be a pretense to going back in militarily. What does the security look like? Who polices the streets of Gaza other than Hamas? And we've already begun to see Hamas come out, take retributional violence against opposition and the clans who had started previously to come out of the woodwork. So what does stabilization look like in Gaza? And then what does border security look like? if and as the IDF withdraws to the lines that were outlined in President Trump's 20-point plan. Beyond that, what does governance look like? Who manages Gaza? The 20-point plan and the New York Declaration that was issued a couple months ago at the UN both talked about Hamas leaving Gaza, or at least leaving its position of power in Gaza, separate from disarming, and the PA coming back in. Or in the case of President Trump's plan, an international peace board, I think he called it, that has representatives from international actors, has President Trump as the head, Tony Blair as sort of the COO, and Palestinian representatives, but we don't know who that looks like or what that looks like and how day-to-day governance takes over. And then, of course, aid. We've seen a surge in humanitarian aid and food aid over the last couple days, but as winter comes in particular, you need shelter, you need medication, you need medical care, you just sort of need the basic elements that are required to live day to day. And how does that get dispersed and managed? And how did some of those systems, the health systems, get rebuilt without Hamas playing a role? Lots of questions about Gaza. I'll say a word about the West Bank and sort of broader US-Israel and Israel international relations, and then I'm happy to take any questions. I think we didn't see in the 20-point plan anything about the West Bank. A couple days before a deal was reached, President Trump said, "I do not support Israeli annexation of the West Bank." But then that wasn't actually part of the deal. So to me, it's still an open question where the US is on Israeli behavior in the West Bank and the question of Israeli annexation in the West Bank. We did see the UAE come out pretty strongly just before Israel was about to take a vote, just before the Israeli government was about to take a vote on formal annexation of the West Bank. The United Arab Emirates came out and said, if you do this, not only will future potential Abraham Accords be threatened, but the existence of current Abraham Accord agreements could be threatened, alluding to their own agreement with Israel. That seemed to put the brakes on Prime Minister Netanyahu for the time being. But I don't think we know yet where those dynamics continue to develop moving forward. And then lastly, one thing I continue to watch and think about is the US-Israel relationship. We're at a pretty low point in US-American perspectives on Israel, both in Congress and popularly. The majority of Americans, according to some recent polls, now question why the US is supporting Israel with military assistance. We saw a record number of members of Congress vote in support of a joint resolution of disapproval over a couple arms sales in the summertime. And generally, is the perception of Israel and Israeli behavior in sort of the court of world opinion is quite low. So whether and how that rebounds, if the war actually comes to a close and if Gaza begins to be rebuilt, is an open question that I continue to think about. I'll stop there and let folks ask questions.
Sorry, Rachel, my mute button was directly behind all of the questions.
Okay.
So I'm going to share with you the first two questions that have come into us. The first one is kind of the key crucial question for us emotionally, for us spiritually, as we think about closure to this time. Will the deceased hostages' remains be returned? Will they be found? Will they be returned? And then a second question, does the US have boots on the ground in Gaza? And I'll expand that to, will the US have boots on the ground in Gaza?
Both good questions. And the first one I was remiss in talking about in my opening. I have no way of knowing if all of the deceased hostages will be returned. I think from what we've seen in President Trump so far and his commitment to returning hostages, I do believe he'll keep pressing for it. I think Israel will certainly keep pressing for it, and I fear that Israel could use if the deceased hostages, if the remains are not returned, I fear Israel could use that as a pretense to go back to war. We've seen conflicting reports. Hamas is saying they don't actually know where all of the bodies are, and they've returned all of those that they have in their possession. We've seen reports from Israel and the United States, leaked intelligence, that actually they do know where more are, and there are some that they just aren't returning because they don't want to. We've also heard President Trump say Hamas really doesn't know and doesn't have the capacity to find all of the remains. So I think we'll have to wait and see. For Hamas, it's unfortunately a negotiating tactic too. They have no cards to play once all the hostages are returned. So I also fear that they're probably playing games to some extent. Um, but I expect they'll be able to find at least a handful more before the conversation about that ends. In terms of boots on the ground, as far as I know, the US does not have boots on the ground in Gaza right now. Those There were Americans who were manning the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, the food aid dispersal mechanism, but they were private contractors. And there was I believe it was 200-person contingent of uniformed personnel, American uniformed personnel going out to, it was sort of reported as going out to Gaza, but then if you dug a little deeper, it was actually going to Israel to be part of, it's typically called a Joint Operations Center, a JOC in military terms, but a coordination center to coordinate the day after planning and implementation in Gaza. So things like which crossings are opening, how does security force or police force training happen, and with whom? I haven't seen the details of what exactly these American military folks will be doing, but it's not an unusual role for them to be working on some of this planning in a joint coordination cell. And what I've seen in other conflicts that I've worked on is when the United States commits personnel, other countries are more willing to do so because other countries trust that we take care of our personnel, whether through sort of intelligence support, military support, making sure they have a good place to live and food to eat. There is a certain level of confidence that if American military personnel are on the ground somewhere, all the personnel who are working with them, even if from other countries, will also be taken care of. So I expect that this is some President Trump wanting to genuinely contribute to the effort, but also a means of getting other countries to contribute to the coalition or the informal coalition in this coordination effort by saying, okay, we'll send our people. Now you have to send yours.
Well, US engagement is a theme in our questions. Raina is asking that Jared Kushner announced some time ago that he wanted to build resorts in Gaza. Is that a likely path in that specific case or in any kind of rebuilding effort that is focused outwardly on tourism? What happens to Palestinians?
It's a great question, and one that I can only speculate on. I think Jared Kushner did, even before Trump came to office the second term, he did have a plan for building resorts in Gaza. I think, first and foremost, they're a real estate family. Uh, then President Trump, early on in his administration, announced his Gaza Riviera vision. I don't want to call it a plan because it was no plan. It was just this idea and this crazy idea, which I think actually did a disservice to the notion that Israel would have to figure out what to do about Gaza after a war ended, and that in fact the United States wouldn't just swoop in and take over the territory and transfer all the Palestinians and build this fantasy land. So I think the resorts, as we've seen Jared Kushner put out a couple years ago, or President Trump talk about, is fantasy. I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. I think it's been interesting to watch over the past week that President Trump has now walked back the idea of involuntary transfer. He is talking about voluntary immigration so that Gazans should be allowed to leave. But the 20-point plan included a nod to that and not to forcible transfer. So I'm hopeful that we continue to see a conversation about Gazans who want to leave can leave instead of Gazans en masse being transferred out of Gaza. In terms of rebuilding, I think it will be a very, very long time before we see resorts built, if ever, simply because of the amount of work that will need to be done to get to that point, particularly with humans still living in Gaza. So I think first we're going to have to see very basic stabilization, probably short term, if shelter, and I'm hopeful that we will see some more sustainable shelter built, but it will probably look like very temporary shelter for a while, something that the UN and humanitarian organizations have done all over the world, where it is inhabitable for different climates and, for winter, for rain, etc., but not the type of place that people want to live for any long term.
The the US is not the only interested party in seeing success and lasting peace between the parties. Where is Turkey in all of this as active support, as support on the sidelines, as prompting action on the part of Hamas or others?
Yeah, Turkey is playing an interesting role. And the relationship between Netanyahu and Erdogan is as low as it's ever been. There is absolutely no love lost. But Turkey did enter the conversation as a mediator in a more in a more meaningful way over the last few weeks. And whether that had any impact on the deal being actually reached, I have no idea. But they are certainly interested in a ceasefire. They're generally interested in being involved where they can benefit. I think we are going to continue seeing Turkey play more of a role in Syria than in Gaza, where they both have more of a stake and already more of a foothold. But I do think they'll continue to be part of the mediator team and probably involved in some way in Gaza, but it will surprise nobody that Israel will not want them to be involved in any real way in Gazan governance, certainly not security. I think the restraints on where they can play will be significant.
I I have some really great questions here, and I'm trying to group them as they make the most sense. Um, let's talk about what's happening inside the borders of Gaza right now. There's a question about the UN, its role, and and there a question around the impartiality of the UN and the UN Refugees Agency in Gaza. And also a question around who is providing support and safety and protection for Gazans from Hamas right now.
Sure. I mean, in terms of who, I'll do the second one first. I don't I don't know exactly where or who are the guys who are donning Hamas uniforms, but uh, you can have almost anyone put on a uniform, carry a gun, and intimidate people. And the type of security that they're providing right now is pretty much wearing a uniform, carrying a gun, and intimidating people. And I think some of the executions we're seeing in the streets are not necessarily because they're individuals who they want to kill immediately because those individuals pose a threat, but more of an intimidation factor and showing that they are back and they are in charge and they are not scared to get rid of people who get in their way. Uh, I think it's incredibly unfortunate on many levels. One of my concerns is that if there isn't an alternative security mechanism soon, the Hamas-led security, which is basically thugs managed by Hamas, will expand and really will provide intimidation for any opposition, any of the clans. There's sort of, I think we're going to see a lot of infighting between different subsets of Gaza, different clans and Hamas, as Hamas tries to reassert control. That said, they don't have anywhere near the command and control that they did previously. So it's not entirely clear who's in charge. I expect who is in charge of different areas of some of these de facto security forces or thugs, depends on the area. Um, but they're going to be the strongest force. And until there's someone else who can push back or a way to stop them, I think we're going to continue seeing more of the same from Hamas. In terms of the UN, there are different elements within the UN. And a lot of the infrastructure that governed basic things, so transport of goods, um, was managed by the UN. And although UNRWA was dismantled, and most of the UN agencies and entities were not allowed to function, some of the infrastructure and the networks of people, of drivers, um, for example, are still the same networks that were managed by the UN because they had the largest and most robust networks previously. I don't think those types of functions are necessarily political or politicized. At some point, and I don't know what it will look like, I highly doubt there'll be a significant role for the UN in Gaza, but at some point there will need to be established an alternative network um, of transit, for example, of trash collection, of certainly education services. So I think I'm just speculating, but I don't think we're going to see the UN come back in and do that. But I do think we're going to see an alternative I'm hopeful that we see an alternative international organization, an alternative international function, who is able to reestablish some of those services.
What do you see as the future of a two-state solution? Where are the negotiations leading to? Where might they end up?
Yeah, I think the future is I don't expect to see anything resembling a two-state solution in the near term. I think it was interesting. I consider it a positive that in Trump's 20-point plan, that pretty much the entire world is behind right now, and Netanyahu agreed to, even if coerced a little bit. There is a nod to a credible path to a Palestinian state, and there is acknowledgement of the Palestinian desire for Palestinian national aspiration, and a commitment to start some sort of process. I think it was a reconciliation. It wasn't talked about as a peace process, but it was an effort that brought Israelis and Palestinians together at the table. I believe it was the last point of the plan. So that says to me that this administration is going to try something. Uh, but I certainly am not I understand, and I expect at this point they understand that there's no appetite for Palestinian statehood in Israel right now. Understandably, there's no leader, even if Prime Minister Netanyahu is not the next prime minister whenever elections happen. There is no single potential prime minister that I'm aware of that would sign up for Palestinian statehood in the near term. There are also some very real things that need to change. The PA is not really capable of governing a state right now. There is certainly no territorial integrity. We've talked a little bit about all the massive challenges with Gaza. I see the future of a two-state solution as more of a path at this point, where I'm hopeful that some of the things that can start to happen over the next, I would say, even decade, are both good and responsible steps. So PA reform, for example, um, security in the West Bank, holding accountable Israeli violence against Palestinians in the West Bank. Uh, some of those things that need to happen, also reform of Palestinian textbooks, sort of the mutual recognition piece, those are all things that are important to happen and will help create a viable pathway toward an eventual two-state solution. I think it will look different. I don't know what an eventual two-state outcome will actually look like on paper. There are so many maps that have been drawn. I mean, I started studying the Israeli-Palestinian conflict over 20 years ago. Um, and the maps haven't changed all that much from what I learned in college to what I then worked on to then the various different iterations. I think there's going to have to be some creative thinking. And I think it's going to be a generational conversation. Um, I I will share in this format. I grew up in a Jewish day school in Washington, D.C. So we were more political than I realized by nature of being in the D.C. area, and very attuned to all things happening in Israel by nature of being a Jewish day school. I remember very clearly when we were all brought into the gym and a big screen It was a long time ago, so it was like a screen, a projector screen that was rolled down from the ceiling in front of the chairs that were put out at the gym. But we were all brought in to watch the Clinton-Arafat-Rabin handshake on the White House lawn. And kids booed and kids cheered, and there was fierce debate among us as kids afterwards whether this was a good thing, whether this was a bad thing. Was Rabin selling Israel? Was peace possible? And then over the 10, 15 years from then until me personally coming to this professionally, the idea of a two-state solution became much more common parlance. It was no longer taboo. It was not supported by everyone, but the idea that two states, or an eventual two-state outcome, became US policy. It became just sort of part of the lexicon. And I think that took about a generation. And I think we are now back at the beginning of a similar process where it's going to take time for folks to come around to the idea that there could be a different future, to rebuild trust, if ever that can happen in the same way after the atrocities of October 7th, and to figure out exactly what that looks like. I think it's going to take time, and it's going to take time both from a rhetorical perspective to sort of figure out what that means, from a healing perspective to sort of how do we deal with what has happened over the past 2 years, and how do we even reimagine a different future. And in terms of the actual tangible steps that I mentioned before about just creating an infrastructure such that a Palestinian state is even possible.
I'm taking this actually just word for word from one of our attendees. The declarations of the Palestinian state are declarations of support for a Palestinian state by the UK, by Canada, by France, by others. Does that help or does that hinder the process from this point?
I think materially it doesn't really make a difference. It makes some people feel good. I think many countries did it as much out of frustration for the war and not feeling they couldn't really do much else, and to satisfy their own domestic political conversations. But at the end of the day, uh, you can have a whole lot of countries recognize Palestine, but if Israel doesn't recognize Palestine, the situation's not really going to change. And where I think it has the potential to do a disservice is if countries recognize Palestine and then stop and don't actually take any effort to work with the PA on the many reforms that they need to contribute to the development of civil society, to contribute to the development of Palestinian political society again. They haven't had elections in a very long time either. And I personally wouldn't, I am not one to advocate for elections as a first step to rebuilding governance at all. But there's a whole political conversation that needs to be had. Abbas is human. At some point, he will presumably pass, and there will need to be a new generation of Palestinian leadership. So if countries stop at recognizing Palestinian statehood and don't actually get involved in some of the sort of day-to-day needs and things to actually develop a state, I do think it has the potential to do a disservice. The other way in which I think it's done a disservice, though I don't, the blame on this is to be shared, is the reaction in Israel has been kind of head to head. A number of countries said they would recognize Palestinian statehood, and then Israel said, okay, well, then we're going to annex the West Bank. And that conversation is not productive. And it was interesting. I've had a conversation with a number of folks, a number of Palestinians, some of whom actually don't want recognition. Their attitude is international recognition does nothing for us. We want the financial support. We want the governance support. We want actual hands-on support to help us improve ourselves. And others who say, yes, great, because when the international community says that they will recognize Palestinian statehood, then that's sending a message to Israel that actually they can't do whatever they want. Others will stand up to them. And I think that piece is lost. I don't think Israel is ever going to be intimidated by international recognition of Palestinian statehood. It tends to have the opposite effect, where it just gets their back up against the wall. And leads them to do even more unproductive things.
You mentioned the threats to annex the West Bank. What is the status of that potentiality? What are the directions, or what are potentially the off ramps to that threat, or does it look likely to be happening?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is we'll see. I don't think the ambitions of those who want to formally annex the West Bank have changed. For Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, they seem to be playing a sort of smart waiting game of we're not going to leave the coalition yet, but also we are not, Bibi is speaking out of both sides of his mouth that yes, he will take President Trump's plan, and he's gone along with it so far, though we've seen reports of Trump basically bullying him to go along with it. Um, but that doesn't change ministers Ben-Gvir or Smotrich or other elements of his coalition's interest in formally annexing the West Bank. I think the barrier, for as long as it continues to be the case, will be President Trump. And I'm not sure President Trump really cares about the status of the West Bank for the status of the West Bank or for the future of an eventual Palestinian state. I think for President Trump, his primary interest is expansion of the Abraham Accords. And we saw over, what was it, 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, over the conversation when Israel nearly brought to a vote formal annexation of the West Bank, that is an issue which so far has the potential to reverse existing Abraham Accords agreements and derail future agreements. So President Trump seemed to get that. I don't know whether he understood it previously, but the statements he made coming out of the UN General Assembly the week, it was just before Rosh Hashanah. I've totally lost track of time with all of the Chagim over the past few weeks, but just before Rosh Hashanah, at the UN General Assembly, where he heard loud and clear from the countries he met with, as well as a group of countries he convened to talk about Gaza and to talk about a Gaza ceasefire before there was a ceasefire, that annexation is a red line for them. And for as long as he has the ambition to expand the Abraham Accords and understands that formal Israeli annexation of the West Bank has the potential to completely derail that effort and that legacy for him, I expect we'll continue to see President Trump stand in the way. And at the moment, Prime Minister Netanyahu seems quite scared of President Trump and to feel like he has to listen to him. So I think that will be the stopgap. But I don't know how long it will last.
You've now brought up Prime Minister Netanyahu, so I'm going to ask the the other big question, not an elephant in the room because we're fully acknowledging it. What is the likelihood of early elections? This current ceasefire and the return of all of the living hostages, how does that impact Netanyahu's chances in an election? And does that impact change whether an election happens in, just a few months or later in 2026 as the kind of normal calendar would have elections happening?
Sure. I will be surprised if we make it to the normal election timeframe. I think if the ceasefire continues and the war is actually over, first question will be, does Prime Minister Netanyahu's coalition fall, or is he able to keep it together? And then I expect at some point he will call for early elections if he can keep it together, but at a point where he feels he has enough of a legacy to run on. So if that is ending the war and getting all the hostages home, if that is some start to a regional integration process, whether it's Syria, Israel, or Saudi, Israel, something to bolster his legacy and reaffirm that he is the only prime minister who can maintain Israel's security and improve its standing. That said, he obviously has yet to be held account for what happened on October 7th. And he also has quite a number of corruption charges that he's faced with. President Trump in the Knesset earlier this week, jokingly or not, said, hey, President Herzog, you should issue Prime Minister Netanyahu a pardon. In the current environment, the current political environment that we have seen over the past 10 months, maybe that becomes a real conversation. I wouldn't put it past President Trump. I wouldn't put it past Prime Minister Netanyahu to actually try and figure out some sort of pardon situation. There's some rumor, which I find hard to believe, but that Prime Minister Netanyahu won't run again. That if he has enough of a legacy to stand on, he'll take it as a win and then actually not run for a next election. I have yet to be convinced of that, but it's part of the conversation. So I expect we'll see elections probably by next spring, but only when Netanyahu thinks he has a chance.
So I would like to ask you, I think we're going to probably take maybe 3 or 4 more questions. I want to ask about the next generation.
Mhm.
Are children in Gaza or in the West Bank being taught in public schools to kill Jews? That's a question we've gotten in prior events, but I wanted to ask you today.
So I honestly don't know what's in the textbooks in Gaza or the West Bank. Um, I can extrapolate from experience right now, not my own, but just the experience of children living in Gaza over the past 2 years. It's not. I think I admire those who can think and really dream of peace, just given the conditions and given how difficult of a time it's been for them under constant bombardment. Um, the West Bank too. I mean, it's been interesting to me to hear, particularly from some of the older generations, kind of between youth and Abbas, that they've learned that violence doesn't work. And they've learned that they've certainly seen Hamas is not the way to go, but um, I am trying to think of when the different intifadas were in my own life, but um, it seemed like for a while for me as a kid and coming into kind of political consciousness and professional work on all of this, that there was just consistent violence against it. It was Palestinian violence. There was the first intifada, the second intifada, and that was the way to achieve peace. That was that has there certainly has been uh, far more terrorism against Israelis than one would hope for. But it hasn't been in the same consistent way as the Second Intifada, for example. It hasn't been in the same sustained campaigns. There are still those who have come to understand, still those Palestinians, I think, who have come to understand that violence is actually not the best way to get what you want. And I've been impressed at the extent to which there is still a belief in a two-state solution. Not among everybody. A lot of people have given up, but among those who are willing to fight for it. And very many fewer, but those who are willing to speak out against the potential for a political horizon and against violence. This is not to speak of what's actually being taught in textbooks. And I think textbook reform and just general education reform will be critical for the PA among the many things that will need to change if there is to be a credible path toward Palestinian statehood. But it gives me a little hope to have conversations with folks who still see a pathway for nonviolent resistance and for politics to actually achieve what they want instead of violence. I think I forgot part of your question.
So no, that's fine, because that actually brings us to what is our final question today, with a little bit of preamble. Central Synagogue just last week closed our most recent exhibition, Innocent Knowledge. It was drawings by children in the West Bank, in Israel, and in Gaza, children across sectors, across faiths, across economic and political spectrum. These were drawings by children made over the last couple of years in response to what they were experiencing on a daily basis. And one of the themes that really emerged from this show was a hope for a better future, hope for a real future, for life, for growth, for flourishing. So I want our last question to be about, these children and that generation across the borders. How can that generation be encouraged to develop longer lasting peace? What are we leaving in their hands to do and to build together? And who can encourage that kind of constructive action in this next generation?
It's a big question, and I think we all have a role. I really think everyone has a role to play. I'm a big believer in experiential education. I think people being exposed to other humans. I'm curious whether any of those pictures that you had on display were exchanged between different communities and whether they got to see what other kids across the border, for example, were drawing. I think understanding the humanity of the other, particularly as kids who are so innocent and so capable of dreaming in a way that I think we lose pretty quickly as adults, um, has real power. And knowing that there are humans on the other side and knowing that there are people who also believe in peace and a better future on the other side, hearing from international communities that they're there to help you, that they're trying to work for you, um, and to help give you a better future, I think goes a long way in helping folks, children or adult, maintain hope. But I think for all of us, there's a responsibility to help create a better conversation. Part of sort of a certain half of IPF's mission statement is elevating the discourse. And what we tend to mean by that is uh, helping to enable a more constructive, informed, thoughtful conversation about the US-Israel relationship, maintaining a Jewish, democratic, and secure Israel, uh, a better way forward on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and what does a sustainable resolution to that look like? I think that applies too to helping the next generation envision and maintain the belief in a better future. I think if we don't talk about it, if we can't help them and their societies to talk about it, it's going to be that much more difficult. And both Gazans and Israelis have a lot of healing to do. It's going to be a long road ahead. But the more that there is a better, more peaceful, more secure political horizon, I think for both, the more opportunity there will be to dream.
This is a beautiful place to end. Thank you for many reasons. One, that you speak our language of experiential education. And I love that we ended on this note of possibility and dialogue and hope. I want to thank you, Rachel and Rabbi Sarah Berman, of course, for pulling this together so quickly. And you can see from our Zoom attendance the desire for these types of conversations. And I want to encourage people to join us next Thursday, the 23rd, for our conversation with Ambassador Daniel Taub, Israeli Ambassador Daniel Taub, Beyond Dispute, where we'll be further exploring these themes of how we engage in productive conversation and of productive discomfort, shall we say. So thank you to both of you, and thank you to everyone for joining.
Thanks for having me.
Have a great afternoon.